Okay, people. This is Matthew Meyer from Wabash College. He's the digital archivist. And he is going to present a program about baseball's Black Pioneer.
Thank you very much, Deli, and thank you all for having me out here tonight. Tonight's program is something I've been working on now for about a year or so. Something that I've become really interested in, and that is sort of this area's connection to one of the most significant black baseball players in the history of the game. And I think, kind of as we approach Jackie Robinson Day, the anniversary when Jackie Robinson debuted in Major League Baseball in 1947, I think a program like this is even more appropriate just to create more of a sense of belonging, to show that sense of belonging here in Crawfordsville. So for starters, how this project started. This project started in my previous position as a reference librarian at Tippecanoe County Public Library in Lafayette. As part of my job up there, I volunteered to write articles for a book that the Historical Association is putting together for Lafayette's Bicentennial, which is this year. And so altogether I wrote 13 different articles for this book. They were all 600-word articles, that's why I wrote so many. And among those, I wrote a lot of articles on Lafayette's baseball history. And in the course of writing those articles, one thing I wanted to do is that I wanted to incorporate more of a black baseball experience into the existing narrative. There wasn't really a whole lot already existing on black baseball in Lafayette. And so I wanted to see how Lafayette kind of tied into black baseball history. And in the course of doing that, I discovered the story of Bud Fowler and his story in Lafayette and then coming down here to Crawfordsville. And it's sort of morphed now into this project. So as we get started, one thing I want to talk about is the significance of black baseball. And black baseball is really a story of triumph through adversity. Triumph through the challenges of racial segregation that kept black baseball players out of white baseball for about 60 to 70 years. It displayed sporting ability in the face of segregation, and it created new heroes to idolize for black people. So now you have these different players like Satchel Paige, Jackie Robinson, Josh Gibson, guys like that. And it became a cultural counterpart to racial discrimination. It became a way of showing well, you say I can't be involved in this, well, I've got these black baseball players who are superior to your baseball players. Over the last 5 to 6 years, especially since 2020, there's been a really significant interest in black baseball. And that really stemmed from the saying Negro Leagues or Major Leagues. In 2021, Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred announced that Negro League statistics from 1920 to 1948 would be integrated into the Major League Baseball record book. So now we have new record holders. A lot of them are now black baseball players, like Josh Gibson. But the problem is that in compiling black baseball records, there's a lot of problems there because they're incomplete and they're scattered. A lot of black baseball players, they played for teams all over the country. Record keeping was very inconsistent. There is no centralized database of those statistics like there is for white baseball players. And so it requires a lot of newspaper research, going through a lot of local newspapers like here in Crawfordsville. And so going through newspapers presents a multitude of challenges. And when you're going through those newspapers, there's two distinct categories to look at. The first one is the black press. Now, black baseball and the black press kind of went hand in hand with each other. Black press advocated for racial integration. Black baseball put that advocacy into action. The problem is that, at least in Indiana, black newspapers were only published in cities with large black populations, so like Indianapolis, Evansville, and Gary. So that means like a city like Crawfordsville did not have its own dedicated black newspaper. Also compounding that problem is that Indiana's black newspapers were weekly, so only published once a week, which meant that coverage of things like baseball games was spotty because they could not cover every game that happened during a week. They would just have to kind of compile the best moments and put those into the paper, leaving some gaps in the record. So because of those gaps, black newspapers must be combined with white newspapers. But in some cases, those present their own problems because of racial biases that may have existed at the time. One example of this is the Lafayette Sunday Times. So the Lafayette Sunday Times is a weekly newspaper published on Sundays, and its coverage was confrontational, we'll just say. At one time, it faced 3 libel suits simultaneously because of its coverage. It was just very, very aggressive, very gossipy, just very confrontational in a lot of ways. And during the Bud Fowler's episode in Lafayette, at one point they described him as being black as a stick of licorice candy. So they were unsparing in their description of black people like Bud Fowler. But even though cities like Lafayette and Crawfordsville did not have their own dedicated black newspaper, that did not mean that they were entirely missing from the record. In some cases, Lafayette newspapers had columns called News of the Colored People, and in Crawfordsville they were typically called Colored Notes. And these were usually societal columns that contained information related to things like marriages, deaths, social gatherings, church meetings, things like that. And sports coverage is kind of minimal in those columns, but it does pop up occasionally. And in this particular column that I have in this slide, at the very bottom, you can see it talks about when Bud Fowler signed to play here in Crawfordsville. I'm going to get back to that one in a little bit. So using newspapers, then, we have to complement those with a lot of different secondary resources. I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail, but these are some of the resources that I use. Emily Thornborough's books on Indiana Black history are really useful, even though they mostly focus on the larger hubs of black culture in Indiana. The Indianapolis ABCs is a book about the Negro League baseball team with the same name. That book actually does talk about Bud Fowler playing in Crawfordsville briefly. And then I recently found this Montgomery County Magazine article here at the library from January of 1988 that talks about Bud Fowler as well. And then some more nationally focused resources. Society of American Baseball Research had published the Negro League from Major Leagues a few years ago. Only the Ball Was White was really the first significant work on black baseball when it was published in the 1970s. It still is really seen as a significant piece, very useful. Raceball by Rob Ruck and Larry Tye's book on Satchel Paige. All of those talk about Bud Fowler, not in great detail, but they do kind of explain the significance to the game. And then the final book there is Jeffrey Michael Lang's book on Bud Fowler, which I used quite a bit in the course of my research. So this book was really the first dedicated monograph on Bud Fowler's life, and it was published in 2013. Used an abundance of primary resources from all over the country because Fowler he played from ranging from Vermont all the way out to California, so he played all over the place. Curiously though, when you look through the bibliography, you see that Crawfordsville and Lafayette newspapers are missing from his research. And instead, he had to use Logansport newspapers to tell this part of the story. Now, for those of you who may not know, Logansport is about 40 or so miles from Lafayette, about 65 miles from Crawfordsville, so not really an ideal location to cover the story in great detail. But when you look further, you kind of understand why Lang had to use Logansport newspapers in his research. For starters, Lang lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he used digitized newspapers from newspaperarchive.com, which is a useful resource, but the problem is that there is no Crawfordsville or Lafayette newspapers from 1888 in Newspaper Archive's holdings. And in some cases, newspapers are still only available on microfilm. The Crawfordsville Journal and the Lafayette Daily Journal from 1888 are only available on microfilm, meaning that Lang would have had to make a physical visit to either one of those libraries, dedicating a lot of time and money to actually research those newspapers. Other newspapers are available digitally, so the Sunday Times, the Crawfordsville Star, the Crawfordsville Daily Argus News, the Crawfordsville Weekly Journal, those are all available digitally, but they all have different access limitations, or they're kind of in obscure locations. Like the Crawfordsville Star is in Google Books, but the Daily Argus News is in Google News. So you kind of have to figure out which one to differentiate. And so with those barriers in mind, you kind of begin to understand why Lang had to use Logansport newspapers, because given where he was in Santa Fe and different access limitations imposed upon him, he was kind of left with no choice but to use Logansport newspapers, which unfortunately doesn't really tell the full story. So that's where my research comes in. My research augments Lang's book by using newspapers from Lafayette and Crawfordsville. Given that I worked at TCPL, I have an extensive knowledge of the Lafayette newspapers available there, and I've become more familiar with what's available down here at CDPL. It also examines barriers to research, those different access limitations that I discussed, and it uncovers an undocumented part of Fowler's life. What I found out is not only did Fowler get rejected from Lafayette and play in Crawfordsville, but there became a rivalry between the two cities over his rejection. So, with baseball, mostly I start with post-Civil War baseball. After the war ended, baseball expanded greatly across the United States. Here in Crawfordsville, the earliest game that I found was in 1866. It probably there may have been one that was earlier than 66, but that's just the oldest one that I found. It was a game played against a team from Greencastle. The Montgomery Club is the earliest known baseball team that I found here in Crawfordsville. They played from 1867 to 1870 at least. They may have played a little bit longer past that, I'm not entirely sure. As part of that, they were supposed to play the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which are the first professional baseball team in baseball history. But the game was postponed, and I've not been able to find out if that game was ever made up or not. So as the sport grew, there became a growing professionalism. Players they were playing more specialized roles within teams. They started being paid money to play baseball games. And as it expanded, it became a national sport, but for who did it become a national sport? So early blacks in baseball, they were given new freedoms brought by the end of the Civil War, but they still faced segregation, including here in Indiana. In Indiana, the earliest known black baseball games occurred in Indianapolis in 1867, so they paralleled the expansion of white baseball. Blacks played on integrated teams, but they did so at their own risk. Their opponents would spike them with their shoes, they would hurl baseballs at them, they would yell racial taunts at them, they really made their lives miserable. And so as an example of that, there are four kind of key early black baseball players, the Walker brothers, Saul White, and Bud Fowler. Moses Walker is the first major league black baseball player. So the difference is that Jackie Robinson debuted in Major League Baseball, the organization. Moses Walker debuted for the team in Toledo, which was a major league team. So there's kind of a slight difference between Moses Walker being the first and Jackie Robinson being the first. So among those players is Bud Fowler. Fowler was born in 1858 in Cooperstown, New York, which, for those of you who don't know, is the home of the Baseball Hall of Fame and the supposed birthplace of baseball. He made his debut in 1878 for a team in Massachusetts and was also a graduate of Oberlin College. He was spiked so often that he created wooden shin guards on his ankles to protect himself, because that's how bad it was for black baseball players at that time. And you might be asking, well, why did he even keep playing if he's just facing all of these challenges? Well, because baseball at the time provided steady work that paid well. A lot of blacks at the time held non-skilled labor positions like gardeners or cooks. Baseball was kind of kind of elevated your status in that way, and it paid very well for that. And so Fowler signed to play for Lafayette in March of 1888, arriving from Utica, New York. Now, the previous year, in 1887, Fowler was playing for the team in Binghamton, New York. At the time, the league that the Binghamton team was in, they did sign black players, but rapidly changed course because their white players objected to the signing of those players. And unfortunately, because of the sort of revolt against black players on their team, Fowler was released from Binghamton in June of 1887 and finished out the year playing in Vermont and New Hampshire. So when Fowler arrived in Indiana in 1888, at the time, Indiana was going through a great demographic shift in its black population. In 1860, there was about 11,000 blacks living in the state. By 1900, it was 57,000. So it was a great shift, big increase. For the most part, blacks were living south of Indianapolis, but they were in small pockets north of Indy, like here in Crawfordsville and Lafayette. There was a civil rights law passed in 1885, but that was rarely enforced. And then there was also segregated education throughout the state, like here in Crawfordsville with the Lincoln School. So Fowler arrived in Lafayette to play for their team in the Indiana State League. I've not been able to figure out what that team's name was. I've gone through all the newspapers, can't figure it out. It's not stated in any of them. At the time, he was eagerly anticipated. He was listed as a noted twirler because he was a pitcher, and he was highly recommended. What's curious, though, is that Fowler's race was not mentioned, nor was his rejection from Binghamton mentioned either. And in this Our Colored People column from the Lafayette Daily Courier, we see that Fowler is listed in here, so it suggests that someone knew he was black, but it's kind of curious how that was not mentioned at the time. So unfortunately for Fowler, when he did arrive, he was almost immediately rejected by Lafayette team management because they told him that the team would consist only of strawberry blondes, and that they did not know he was black because supposedly there were two John Fowlers, and Bud Fowler did not submit his photograph as requested by Lafayette team management. And then these two newspaper articles from the Lafayette Daily Courier and the Lafayette Daily Journal, they show that they list more about his rejection, and then the Daily Journal mentioned that he would be going to Crawfordsville after being rejected. So what did baseball in Crawfordsville look like in 1888? So Crawfordsville was going to be in the Central Interstate League. They were going to be known as the Hoosiers. Going to play 112 games that year. It was an 8-team league in 3 states, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, Crawfordsville being the only team in Indiana at the time. No season tickets were sold. No Sunday baseball was played either, for that matter. So no games on Sundays. And I've gone through 4 Crawfordsville newspapers, and I cannot for the life of me find out where their ballpark was in town. It's just, I know that it had a telephone and its own irrigation system, but other than that, I have not been able to figure out where in town it was. So Fowler arrived a few days after being rejected from Lafayette, and at the time he was noted as always attracting the crowd. Now this was something that I discovered as part of my research that I thought was really interesting, and this was Fowler's reply. After arriving in Crawfordsville, Fowler wrote a lengthy reply to Lafayette management in response to their claims that they did not know that he was black. Fowler's reply first appeared in the March 28, 1888 Crawfordsville Journal, and then was reprinted in its entirety the next day in the Lafayette Daily Courier. And really what it is, that it stands as a scathing rebuke of baseball's color line that prevented black baseball players from playing with their white counterparts. So Fowler's reply, I don't have the time to go through the whole thing, but I will give you some of the highlights. Fowler saying that management not knowing his race, that he thought was very queer. And then in regards to having black players on teams, Fowler asked, don't we draw people to your games? Don't we give you guys more money to keep you guys afloat? And then also lamenting knowing that Lafayette could be so prejudiced at the time, given what had happened post-Civil War. And then he concluded his reply by saying that he hoped that he would see them on the diamond. So this is something that I wanted to highlight, the difference between what Jeffrey Michael Lane used with the Logansport newspaper versus what's available in either the Lafayette or the Crawfordsville newspaper. I used a scan of the Lafayette newspaper because I could just get a better scan than I could from the microfilm from the Crawfordsville Journal. So you can see that the Logansport article, very short, is just a brief summary of what happened. Over there on the other side is the full-length article, much more detailed, much more direct response to Lafayette management written by Fowler. And at the time, really, for a black baseball player to publicly scorn a white baseball team like this is significant. Like, this did not happen very often. And so this was something that I found very interesting once I uncovered it. So Fowler eventually did sign with Crawfordsville in April of 1888, and he was praised in the Colored Notes column in the Crawfordsville Journal, saying that it is hoped that Mr. Fowler will have a chance to show the people of Lafayette that a colored man may be a ball player. And after that, exhibition games against Lafayette were scheduled, meaning that Fowler would be returning to Lafayette after his rejection. In the lead up to these games, Crawfordsville newspapers vowed vengeance. They were going to go up to Lafayette, and they were going to avenge the wrongs that had been committed against Fowler. On the other side of that, Lafayette newspapers were arrogant. They felt that they did no wrong, that Crawfordsville was just blowing smoke. In the first game, Fowler pitched, gave up 6 hits and 4 runs, and Crawfordsville lost the game 4-2. In the second game, Fowler committed an error, and Crawfordsville lost the game 4-1. And this article here shows sort of the rivalry that was developing between Lafayette and Crawfordsville over Fowler's rejection. At the very end, you see in this Lafayette newspaper clipping that if the Lafayette team doesn't shove this talent down the Athenians' throat, they had better retire from the field. So it was becoming heated between the two cities. So in the aftermath of these exhibition games, Lafayette newspapers were jubilant. They were glad Crawfordsville lost. They could shut Crawfordsville up, basically. But Crawfordsville was by no means discouraged, and they scheduled more rematches for the following month. In the meantime, the Crawfordsville team played exhibitions here around the community, including against Wabash College. And I have tried finding any kind of articles, and I've only found one article on this game, and it does not mention if Fowler actually played in that game or not. So I'm unsure if Wabash would have played against him. It certainly would have been significant, I think, if that had happened, but I've not been able to confirm that. So Crawfordsville season officially begins on May 1st with a game against Davenport, a game that they won 20-13. Back then they had a lot of really high-scoring games because a lot of players didn't wear gloves, so a lot of defensive errors were made, so that's why you would have these really high-scoring games. In this case, Fowler had 2 hits, 2 runs, and 2 steals in that first game. And finally, a few days later against Peoria, Fowler dislocated his thumb while fielding a ground ball, but he still stayed in the game, despite having that broken thumb. Now, these were men's men back then. These guys could play, you know. So Crawfordsville starts their season, and then they take a few days off to play a couple more rematches against Lafayette on May 11th and May 12th. Crawfordsville split the series, won the first game, lost the second game. Fowler did not play in either of these games because management, realizing these were exhibition games, decided to keep their best players at home to avoid risk of injury. And given that Fowler had broken his thumb, probably good that he had a couple of days off at that point. Curiously, in game 2, there was umpiring so bad that the Daily Argus News said that the umpire should be indicted for his behavior in that game. And then I think this quote came from the Crawfordsville Journal saying that Crawfordsville leaves her best players at home. This was in response to Lafayette trying to once again brag, saying that they were better than Crawfordsville. Another article that I found, in addition to Fowler's reply that I found interesting, was this article from the Daily Argus News called Once Fairness. And this basically asked fans to stop, yelling racial slurs at black baseball players like Fowler. They called it obnoxious to colored fans of the game. And they said that by not yelling these taunts at players, it would alleviate pains of people receiving the insults. And it really was an attempt to sort of create belonging, kind of give Fowler a welcoming atmosphere, just given all that he was going through at the time. And so I was kind of struck by finding this article, after reading Fowler's reply, and then finding this, calling for more belonging atmosphere. Going into June of 1888, we started to see some turmoil in the Central Interstate League. The team in Rockford, Illinois was announced to be transferred due to low fan turnout, so they were not able to make enough money to survive in Rockford. It was proposed that they were going to move to either Terre Haute or Springfield, Illinois, but ultimately the move did not happen. Now, low fan support was just one reason why the Central Interstate League was struggling at the time. Because they're still relying on train travel, teams would be hindered by the long travel distance. It was estimated at the beginning of the season that Crawfordsville would travel almost 4,000 miles by train over the course of the season. And in some cases, teams were liable to miss their trains, meaning that they would forfeit games. This happened early in the season in a game against Rockford. Rockford missed their train to Crawfordsville, and so they had to forfeit the game, and Crawfordsville won. So it was starting to get starting to get tedious within the league. But that meant we could still have yet another rematch against Lafayette, this time on June 10th, and this time Fowler was going to play. Fowler scored the first run in the game, but unfortunately Crawfordsville lost that game 8-4. Now this is my favorite quote down here at the bottom. The Lafayette Daily Journal wrote that Crawfordsville can't play ball. In response, the Crawfordsville Weekly Journal wrote, Lafayette are suckers. So it just shows you again, this rivalry was really heating up. Not long after that exhibition game, though, it was announced that the Hoosiers were going to be moving to Terre Haute. Low fan support meant they couldn't make enough money here in Crawfordsville, so it was thought that by moving to a larger city like Terre Haute, they'd be able to make more money and be able to turn a profit. Along with that, it was announced the team in Decatur, Illinois was going to disband, and that Lafayette would take their place in the Central Interstate League, meaning now that these two rivals were going to be in the same league now. So over their final weeks in Crawfordsville, there was a noteworthy game against Rockford on June 20th. Fowler was called in the 5th or 6th inning to relieve the starting pitcher, but he refused to come into that game. At the time, Crawfordsville was down like 9-0, and so Fowler just did not want to waste his time basically playing in a blowout loss. But because he refused to pitch, he was fined $10 by management. But then management remitted that fee because they feared that he would leave the team over that $10 fine. So then, wrapping it up here, Lafayette played against Crawfordsville over June 29th through July 2nd, with Crawfordsville winning 2 of those 3 games. A couple of them were rained out and they weren't made up. So Crawfordsville team moves to Terre Haute. Their first games were on July 4th. Terre Haute won both games. Fowler was frequently applauded in those games. He's listed here in the box scores from those first 2 games. Now, what's curious about the Terre Haute part of this story is that this is missing entirely from Lang's book. And again, it's the same reasons that I mentioned earlier. There are no Terre Haute newspapers from 1888 in newspaperarchive.com, meaning once again that Lang had to use Logansport newspapers where applicable. And Logansport's about 120 miles from Terre Haute, so not even close to giving a good account of what was going on down there. But unfortunately, moving to a new city did not help the Hoosiers. It was announced on July 24th of that year that they were going to be disbanding. But, as the Crawfordsville papers noted, they survived longer than the Lafayette Club, which had disbanded earlier in July. Fowler himself moved on to Santa Fe, and something that I found was that it was rumored that he was asked to play for the team in Indianapolis, which was in the National League, so this would have been a major league team. And had he played in Indianapolis, he would have been the very first black baseball player in the National League, beating Jackie Robinson by about 60 years. But I've not found any contemporary newspaper accounts that support that claim. I just found some stuff that was written after the fact. So it's possible he was asked, but I'm inclined to believe that he was not. So what happened after Fowler left Indiana? Well, he continued playing across the United States. So he played in Santa Fe, then eventually played in Colorado, and he played in other states too. In 1902, he returned to Indiana to play, or as a secretary for a team in the Indianapolis Colored League. I believe it was a 4-team league in Indianapolis of just all black teams. But that league only lasted a couple of months, so then Fowler left once again. He passed away in February of 1913, and then finally, in 2022, he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame as a pioneering black baseball player. So, some final thoughts. Black baseball was about relentless persistence. We see this with Fowler, even though he was rejected from numerous cities, even if opposing players attacked him or yelled racial slurs at him, he still kept playing. We also see that records are scattered across the country, and Fowler remains obscure because of this. You have to do a lot of hard research, not just in digital form, but also making visits to the library to use things like microfilm or even print newspapers. But with that, though, we now have a new chapter in his career. And we also discovered that Crawfordsville was home to a black baseball pioneer. That concludes my presentation.
Any questions?
Are the records, which now have been combined with the White League records, are they at all indicated by an asterisk or any such thing?
No, but there are caveats to that because black baseball teams would play like a lot of exhibitions, so those exhibitions are not counted. Only the games that they would have played against other black baseball teams are counted in the official record book. So you kind of have to learn to differentiate between the different games and sort of how those stats were compiled.
Do you know if Fowler ever supported himself by anything other than playing ball?
He was a barber, I believe, in the off seasons.
Okay.
And secretary,
Yeah, and then as he got older, he wasn't playing as much. Then he would either be secretary to teams or he would be like their manager.
And when was it? I was really stunned that your story began in 1866. I think you said.
Mm-hmm.
When was it? I recall Abner Doubleday.
Mm-hmm.
When did he credited with originating baseball? Do anyone recall that? I didn't know it was this early. Wouldn't have?
Well, they supposedly he created baseball in the 1840s when he was a student at West Point, because Cooperstown is close to West Point.
Wow.
But that story has been debunked multiple times, and so we don't have like a set date on when someone invented the game. It just kind of started appearing, and then it started being covered as newspaper coverage expanded.
Another question, during the Civil War, do you have any indication that any of the troops, North or South, ever recreated playing ball?
Oh yeah, they definitely did. I know like in Confederate prison camps, the Union prisoners would play games against each other. And then they would also play like, I guess like away from the battlefield, if you want to put it that way. And that's how the game spread after the war, because then once they would go back home, then they would kind of bring the game with them to wherever they were from.
Okay, thank you very much.